Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are stepping into a territory that is, it's really the biological bedrock for human continuity. We're talking about estrogens and progestins.
It's a huge topic.
It is, but before you tune out thinking this is just about the pill or hot flashes, I really want you to completely reframe how you visualize these molecules.
Yeah, that's a good place to start because the way it's usually taught is, frankly, a bit reductionist.
Yeah.
People tend to think of these hormones as simple switches. Flip the switch, puberty starts.
Right?
Flip it again, ovulation, turn it off, menopause.
Exactly. And that binary on-off metaphor just completely falls apart the second you open the source material we have today. We are pulling from the absolute heavyweights of pharmacology.
The titans.
We have Goodman and Gilman's chapter on estrogens, progestins, and the female reproductive tract, and then Kapsung's chapter on the gonadal hormones and inhibitors. And the vibe I got immediately wasn't mechanics flipping switches. It felt much more like orbital mechanics, or maybe a conductor leading an orchestra.
I love the orchestra analogy. That is spot on because time is the central character here. If you think about a standard drug, like a painkiller, say ibuprofen, it's very transactional.
Okay.
You take it, it blocks an enzyme, the pain stops, the drug clears out, and you're done. It's a very linear process.
Right. A to B to C, boom, done.
But estrogens and progestins, they are conductors. They are orchestrating this incredible symphony that plays out over days and weeks, months, and even decades.
So they're not just signaling a cell to do one thing right now.
Not at all. They are managing sequences. They signal a cell to grow and then to wait and then to differentiate and then to maintain and eventually maybe to shut down or shed. If you get the timing wrong, if the woodwinds come in before the strings, the whole piece just falls apart.
The biology fails.
The biology fails. So we're dealing with a system where when is just as important as what?
Or maybe more important.
When is arguably more important. The exact same molecule, just delivered at a different frequency or at a different time of the month, can have the complete opposite effect on the system.
That is what hooked me. So we're going to explore this complexity. We've got Kapsung, which is, it's our clinical scaffold, the what and the how of prescriptions, providing that organized roadmap.
And then we have Goodman and Gilman, which is our deep molecular dive, the why behind the receptor shapes and the genetic signaling, the real nitty-gritty.
And we should probably drop our standard disclaimer here.
Good idea.
We're synthesizing these two incredibly dense chapters to give you a conceptual map. We want to connect the dots for you, help you build a mental framework. But this is not, and I repeat, not a substitute for the text.
Absolutely not. If you are a clinician, a student, anyone treating patients, you have to read the chapters. We are here to make that reading trigger those aha moments, not to replace the hard work of actual studying.
Consider this the architectural blueprint.
You still have to lay the bricks.
Exactly. So before we jump into the deep end, let's preview the key takeaways so you know what to listen for.
Okay, first, we really want you to understand the cyclic logic. Why the sequence matters so much more than just the concentration alone. Second, receptor diversity. We'll talk about how ER-alpha, ER-beta, and the progesterone receptors really shape the context of a drug's action.
Third, we're going to look at central versus peripheral effects. So how the brain talks to the ovaries and, more importantly, how we can hack that feedback loop pharmacologically. And fourth, therapeutic intent.
Right. Are we trying to prevent pregnancy? Are we trying to replace hormones in menopause? Or are we maybe trying to induce fertility? The goal changes everything.
And finally, risk-benefit framing. We have to talk about thrombosis, about cancer risk, and the cardiovascular nuance that has, frankly, confused the medical world for 20 years.
It's a complicated story.
So our mission today is to explore these hormones through three specific lenses, just to keep us organized: cycles, continuity, and choice.
I like that structure. It moves really nicely from the basic biology to the therapy.
Right, cycles, because everything here is rhythmic. You don't understand the pulse, you don't understand the hormone. Then continuity, because these hormones maintain our bodies over a lifetime. They affect bone, blood, the brain, things way beyond just reproduction.
And then choice.
Which is where the pharmacology really shines. This is where we intervene. We stop the cycle, we restart it, or we modify it.
And that choice part is where things can get really heavy. We're talking about contraception, abortion, menopause management, cancer risks. Every single choice in this field has a trade-off. There are no free lunches.
So let's start with the beat. Section 1, the physiology of rhythm.
The neural clock.
I want to start at the very, very beginning, puberty. Kapsung calls the onset of puberty Ganadarsh an enigma, which I found surprisingly poetic for a pharmacology text. Why is it an enigma?
It's an enigma because all the machinery is there long before it actually turns on. For a long time, the prevailing theory was that the pituitary gland in a child was just immature.
Like a broken engine or something.
Or a computer that hadn't booted up yet, but experiments showed that just wasn't true at all.
How did they figure that out?
Well, if you take a prepubertal child, or more often in animal models, a juvenile primate, and you inject them with GnRH, which is gonadotropin-releasing hormone.
The master signal from the brain.
Right. The pituitary wakes up immediately. It starts pumping out LH and FSH. The ovaries or tests, they respond. The whole system works perfectly.
So the engine works, the car is gassed up, but it's just not moving.
The car is parked, the engine is idling, but someone has their foot slammed on the brake pedal. The childhood brain exerts this massive, powerful inhibitory effect on the hypothalamus. So puberty isn't about turning the system on, it's about lifting that inhibition. It's about taking your foot off the brake.
That is a crucial distinction. It's a release of suppression. So who's the driver? Who decides to lift the foot? This is where the source material gets into some alphabet soup with the KND system, KNDY.
The KND neurons. This was a really major discovery in neuroendocrinology. It refers to a specific cluster of neurons in the arcuate nucleus of the hypothalamus, and they express 3 distinct peptides.
Kisspeptin, neurokinin B, and dynorphin.
Hence KNDI.
Okay, let's unpack the KND shop. What is each one doing?
Kisspeptin is the star of the show. It is the most potent stimulator of GnRH release that we know of. It is the gas pedal. If you spray kisspeptin on these neurons, the system just roars to life.
But in a child, it's not roaring.
It's not. And that's because of the other players and some key genetic repressors. Goodman and Gilman points out some really fascinating genetic data here about a protein called MKRN3.
MKRN3. McCorn ring finger protein 3.
Sounds like a droid name, doesn't it? But it's a repressor. It seems to sit on the genes that drive puberty and just keeps them silent during childhood. As a child ages, for reasons we're still figuring out, the expression of MKRN3 drops.
The brake starts to lift.
The brake lifts, the KNDD neurons start to fire. But they don't just fire randomly, they start a conversation among themselves.
A conversation? What do you mean?
I mean, they literally talk to each other using these peptides. Neurokinin B acts as the accelerator within the group. It stimulates the whole cluster to fire together.
Okay, so that's the go signal.
But then, right after they fire, they release dynorphin. And dynorphin acts as the brake. It's an opioid peptide that inhibits the cluster. It shuts them up for a little while.
So you have this push-pull dynamic.
Yeah.
Excitation, then inhibition.
Yeah.
Excitation, then inhibition.
And that push-pull creates a pulse.
A rhythm.
Exactly. It creates an oscillation. And this brings us to one of the most fundamental concepts of all of endocrinology, the pulse generator. The hypothalamus acts as a neuronal clock. It fires a burst of GnRH roughly once per hour.
This was the part that blew my mind. I always thought hormones were just, poured into the blood like adding milk to coffee. You just pour it until it's the right concentration.
Yeah.
But you're saying it's not a pour, it's a beat, a drum beat.
It is absolutely a beat. And this isn't just a quirk of nature. It is a fundamental requirement for the system to work. There were famous experiments done, the Beltsville sperm experiments and others in rhesus monkeys, where they tried to treat patients with GnRH deficiency by giving a steady, continuous IV drip of GnRH.
And you'd think, logically, that if a little is good, a steady stream must be better.
And logic would be dead wrong. When you give a continuous stream of GnRH, the pituitary initially flares up for a bit and then complete silence. It shuts down entirely.
Wait, what happens?
Downregulation. The receptors on the pituitary, the GnRH receptors, they get completely overwhelmed by the constant signal. They internalize. They literally pull themselves inside the cell to hide from the signal.
So the cell just stops listening?
It stops listening. And this is actually how we treat things like prostate cancer or precocious puberty. We give a continuous superagonist, a drug called leuprolide, to chemically shut the entire system off.
That is just wild. So to make the system work, you absolutely need the silence between the notes.
You need the knock, knock, knock. That intermittent stimulation allows the receptors to reset themselves and stay sensitive to the signal.
And Ketson mentions that the speed of the knocking actually changes the message, right? It's like Morse code.
It is. The pituitary is a very sophisticated decoder. If the hypothalamus knocks fast, high-frequency pulses, the pituitary tends to synthesize and release LH, or luteinizing hormone.
Okay.
If the knocking slows down low-frequency pulses, it favors the synthesis of FSH, or follicle-stimulating hormone.
So the hypothalamus isn't just an on-off switch. It's a telegraph operator sending completely different codes just by changing the tempo.
Correct. And that tempo changes dynamically throughout the menstrual cycle to orchestrate the different phases. You get fast pulses in the follicular phase to drive estrogen production, and then slower pulses in the luteal phase to support progesterone.
Okay, so the signal goes out, pulse, pulse, pulse. It hits the pituitary. The pituitary releases LH and FSH. These hormones travel down to the ovaries. And now we have to talk about the two-cell, two-gonadotropin theory.
This is classic physiology, but you have to understand it to understand how the drugs work. It's foundational.
Katsung describes this like a factory line with two different workers. You've got the theca cell and the granulosa cell.
Right, and location is everything here. Imagine the theca cell is on the outside of the developing follicle. It's right next to the blood vessels. Its job is to grab cholesterol from the blood, specifically from LDL particles, and start the manufacturing process.
So it's the raw materials guy.
Exactly. The theca cell has LH receptors. When LH binds, it activates the machinery to pull cholesterol into the mitochondria using the STAR protein, that's steroidogenic acute regulatory protein. It chops off the side chain of cholesterol and turns it into androgens.
Wait, hold on a second. The female ovary is making testosterone.
It is. The theca cell makes androstenedione and testosterone, but here is the critical catch. The theca cell cannot make estrogen. It lacks the essential final enzyme in the assembly line, which is aromatase.
So it can build the chassis of the car, but it can't paint it.
Perfect analogy. It builds the androgen chassis. Now enter the granulosa cell.
The second worker.
The second worker. The granulosa cell is on the inside of the follicle, right next to the egg. It has FSH receptors. It takes those androgens that are passed over by the theca cell, and under the influence of FSH, the granulosa cell activates aromatase. It takes the androgen and aromatizes it into estradiol.
So theca makes the androgen, granulosa turns it into estrogen. One can't do it without the other.
Correct. And this matters so much clinically. For example, in polycystic ovary syndrome, or PCOS, we often see elevated levels of LH. That LH signal drives the theca cells to make tons and tons of androgen.
A surplus of raw materials.
A huge surplus. And if the granulosa cells can't keep up with converting all of it, you end up with high testosterone levels spilling into the blood. And that's where you get the acne, the hirsutism. All those symptoms come from the factory line being out of balance.
It's a supply chain issue. Too much raw chassis, not enough paint.
Exactly right.
Okay, so we have estrogen being produced. It's flooding the system. Now we get to section 2, the feedback loop. And this is where the plot really twists. Because usually in the body, if you make a lot of something, the body says, okay, that's enough, please stop making it. That's negative feedback.
And for the vast majority of the menstrual cycle, most of the follicular phase and the entire luteal phase, that is exactly true. Estrogen goes back up to the brain and it inhibits the pituitary. It tells the Candidae neurons to chill out. It keeps LH and FSH in check.
Keeps the system stable.
It keeps it stable, but then you get the estrogen paradox.
The twist.
The twist. In the middle of the cycle, right as the dominant follicle is mature and pumping out tons of estrogen, the estrogen levels climb very rapidly. They hit a specific threshold. And Goodman and Gilman is very specific here. You need a concentration of roughly 200 picograms per milliliter, and it has to be sustained for about 36 to 48 hours.
That's a very specific unlock code.
It is. And when the pituitary and the hypothalamus see that high, sustained level of estrogen, the switch flips. Negative feedback suddenly becomes positive feedback.
The floodgates just open.
Instead of suppressing LH, the pituitary suddenly dumps its entire reserve of LH into the bloodstream. This is the famous LH surge.
And that surge is what causes the egg to burst out. That's ovulation.
Exactly. It's a massive hormonal signal that triggers the physical rupture of the follicle and the release of the oocyte. It's like the system is designed to be quiet, quiet, quiet until the product is absolutely perfect, and then it just screams, "Goo!"
And that scream is triggered by the product itself.
It's a beautiful piece of engineering. The hormone that prepares the egg is the very same hormone that eventually pulls the trigger to release it.
But you can't just have positive feedback loops running wild in biology, or the system would just burn itself out. We need a break. And that brings us to progesterone.
The progestation hormone.
I always think of progesterone as the responsible older sibling. Estrogen is the party planner, setting everything up, getting the decorations ready, building up the uterine lining.
And then progesterone comes in.
And progesterone comes in and says, okay, everyone, calm down. Let's maintain this. No more new guests. Let's make this place hospitable for a potential pregnancy.
That's a very accurate way to put it. Progesterone is produced by the corpus luteum, which is basically the leftover shell of the follicle after the egg has left. And its main job, in terms of the cycle's rhythm, is to act as a powerful brake on the brain.
Back to the telegraph operator in the hypothalamus.
Yes. Progesterone tells the hypothalamus to slow its tapping way down. It dramatically decreases the frequency of GnRH pulses.
And this is the aha moment for contraception, isn't it? This is the key.
It is the fundamental mechanism. We'll get into the clinical details later, but just conceptually. If you give a woman a synthetic progesterone, a progestin, you are artificially slowing down that pulse generator.
You are hacking the clock.
You're hacking the clock. You keep the tempo so slow that the pituitary never builds up enough pressure or the right signal to trigger that big LH surge. And if there is no surge,
There's no ovulation.
no ovulation, the whole system is suppressed centrally.
So the mini pill, the progestin-only pill,
Mhm.
it works not by, physically blocking the egg, but by hacking the rhythm of the brain.
Precisely. It keeps the background beat too slow for the crescendo to ever happen.
That is absolutely fascinating.
Oh.
It really is all about rhythm. So now let's zoom in. We've looked at the organs, the clock, the feedback loop. Now I want to look at the molecules themselves. Section 3, molecular mechanisms. Because this is where Goodman and Gilman gets really deep.
Right.
Estrogens and progestins don't just float into a cell and bounce around randomly. They bind to a special class of receptors called nuclear receptors.
Yeah, this is a key point. These aren't receptors on the surface of the cell, like the ones for adrenaline that just open a quick ion channel and you get an effect in milliseconds. These are different. These receptors are located inside the cell, often waiting in the cytoplasm or the nucleus itself, and they're held in a sort of inactive state by chaperone proteins, most famously heat shock protein 90 or HSP90.
So they're just waiting for the signal.
They're waiting. When the hormone, which is lipid-soluble, diffuses across the cell membrane and binds to the receptor, that HSP90 chaperone falls off. The receptor then changes its shape, pairs up with another one, it dimerizes, and the whole complex moves directly onto the DNA.
They're transcription factors.
They're literal transcription factors. They physically sit on the DNA at specific sites called hormone response elements and recruit all the machinery needed to read a gene and make a protein. It's a slower, more profound effect than a surface receptor.
This leads us directly to the concept that confuses everyone, including me, until I read this chapter very carefully. The selective estrogen receptor modulators.
The designer estrogens.
Exactly. We have drugs like tamoxifen. Tamoxifen is famous. It blocks estrogen in the breast. It's a cornerstone of breast cancer treatment.
Oh, well.
But it acts like estrogen in the bone, preventing osteoporosis, and also in the uterus, where it can unfortunately increase the risk of uterine cancer.
A paradox.
How?
Hello?
How can one drug be an antagonist and an agonist at the same time? It's the same molecule.
It is the same molecule, but the lock that it fits into is dynamic and a bit more complicated than a simple keyhole. This is the concept of conformational change.
Okay, break that down for us.
All right. Imagine the estrogen receptor is a complex 3D puzzle box. It has a sort of lid on it called helix 12. When natural estradiol, the body's own estrogen, binds, the box folds perfectly around it, and that helix 12 lid snaps shut, creating a very specific, smooth surface.
Let's call that shape a smooth surface.
Okay, shape A. Now, floating around in the nucleus are other proteins called co-activators. They are the go signals. They see that smooth surface of shape A, they recognize it, they bind to it, and they help turn the gene on in.
Got it. Estrogen leads to shape A, which recruits a co-activator which turns the gene on.
Exactly. Now imagine tamoxifen binds instead. Tamoxifen is a bulkier molecule. It fits into the binding pocket, but it's too big for the lid to close properly. That helix 12 gets stuck in a half-open position. It creates a completely different 3D shape on the surface.
Okay, shape B. The puzzle box is folded differently.
Now here is where the concept context is king comes into play. In a breast cell, the main helper proteins floating around are co-repressors. They're the stop signals. They see shape B and they latch right onto it, they bind, and they shut the gene down. That's an antagonist effect.
But in the bone, it's different.
In a bone cell or a uterine cell, the available pool of these helper proteins is totally different. The co-activators present in bone are different from the ones in the breast, and they look at shape B and they say, hey, I can work with that. They're able to bind to that shape and turn the gene on in.
So it's not just about the key, which is the drug. It's about the room you are standing in, which is the tissue, and who else is in that room with you, which are the co-regulators.
That is the perfect summary. The drug creates a potential shape. The tissue context determines what that shape means, whether it's an on-N signal or an O-off-F signal.
That is the holy grail of pharmacology, isn't it? Trying to design that perfect key.
It absolutely is. If we can design a drug that creates a shape that is only recognized by coactivators in bone and heart, but only recognized by co-repressors in the breast and uterus, we would have the perfect drug for menopause. That's what we are chasing with newer SERMs like basidoxifene.
And to make it even more complicated, we have to mention that there isn't just one estrogen receptor. There's ER-alpha and ER-beta.
The yin and the yang of the estrogen world. Generally speaking, ER-alpha is the classic accelerator. It's what drives growth in the breast and the uterus. ER-beta, on the other hand, often acts as a brake. It's anti-proliferative.
And they can be in the same cell.
They can. In fact, they can form a heterodimer, one alpha and one beta receptor paired together. And when that happens, the beta subunit often inhibits the alpha's activity. It tones it down.
So you have a tumor that, through mutation, has lost its ER-beta receptors.
It might grow much faster because it's lost its own internal brake system. The balance between alpha and beta in a given tissue is a key determinant of its health and its response to hormones.
And does the same kind of complexity apply to progesterone receptors? Katsung mentioned PRA and PRB.
Yes, very similar story. They actually come from the same gene, just started at different points, so you get two different protein isoforms. PRB is usually the main activator. It mediates the progestation effects, things like mammary gland development.
And PRA?
PRA often acts as a dominant negative repressor. It can literally sit on PRB and shut up. So again, it's the ratio that matters.
So if two women take the exact same hormone therapy, and one feels great while the other has terrible side effects?
It could very well be that their individual ratios of PRA to PRB in their target tissues are genetically different, or their co-regulator profiles are different.
It really highlights that one size fits all is just a dangerous concept in endocrinology.
It really is. The individual variation at the receptor level is massive and underappreciated.
Okay, let's move to section 4, clinical pharmacology. We've talked about the rhythm and the molecules. Now let's talk about the choice, how we actually use this knowledge. And the biggest application, globally, has to be contraception.
By far. And we've already touched on the core mechanism suppressing the pulse generator to stop ovulation. But let's look at the actual ingredients in the pills. Most pills are combined oral contraceptives, or COCs. That means estrogen plus a progestin.
Okay, so why both? If the progestin is the one stopping the pulse generator, why do we even need the estrogen in there?
That is a fantastic and very important question. And you're right, technically you don't need the estrogen for the actual contraceptive effect. As we said, progestin-only pills exist and they work. But progestins have a downside on the tissue level. Okay? They can make the endometrium the lining of the uterus atrophy. It becomes very thin and fragile.
And fragile things tend to break.
Exactly. Women on progestin-only methods often experience breakthrough bleeding, just random, unpredictable spotting throughout the month. It's not dangerous, but it's annoying, and it is the #1 reason women stop taking the pill.
So the estrogen is there for continuity, to stabilize the whole cycle.
That's the perfect word for it. The small amount of estrogen in a combined pill stimulates the endometrium just enough to stabilize it, preventing that random bleeding. It provides what we call cycle control. It makes the withdrawal bleed at the end of the pack predictable and regular.
Okay, so to use an analogy, progestin is the bouncer stopping ovulation from happening, and estrogen is the manager making sure the venue stays orderly and people don't get upset.
That works. And the progestin also have another important peripheral mechanism that Katsung emphasizes, its effect on cervical mucus.
Right, the physical barrier.
Yes. Under the influence of estrogen alone, like during ovulation, cervical mucus is watery, alkaline, and very stretchy. They call it spin bar kite. It actually forms these little channels that help guide sperm up into the uterus. It's basically an invitation.
A welcome mat. And progestin.
Progestin slams the door shut. It makes the mucus scant, thick, viscous, and acidic. It turns the cervix into a hostile brick wall. So even if, by some fluke, an egg were released, the sperm can't get past the front door.
It's a double security system.
Yeah.
Central suppression and a peripheral barrier. Now let's talk about the progestins themselves,
Right.
because they aren't all the same. Katsung lists different generations of them. Why do we keep inventing new ones?
It's all about side effects. The early ones, the first generation, like norethindrone, were derived from testosterone. Chemically, they looked a lot like androgens.
And they acted like them, too.
They did. They had residual androgenic activity. They could cause acne, weight gain, hirsutism, which is unwanted hair growth, and they could cause negative changes in cholesterol profiles.
Not ideal.
Not ideal. So the later generations, like norgestimate or desogestrel, the third generation, were designed to be much cleaner. They have far less androgenic activity. And then the newest ones, the fourth generation, like drospirenone, that's a whole different story.
How so?
Drospirenone is actually derived from spironolactone.
The diuretic. The blood pressure medication.
The very same. So drospirenone is actually anti-androgenic. It can actively help treat acne. And because it's related to a diuretic, it also blocks the mineralocorticoid receptor, so it helps prevent the water retention and bloating some women get.
So the choice of pill isn't just random. If a patient comes in complaining of acne, you might specifically choose a pill with drospirenone in it.
Exactly. It's about tailoring the side effect profile of the progestin to the individual patient's needs.
Now, what about the opposite intervention? What if we want to end a pregnancy? We have mifepristone.
Mifepristone is a fascinating drug pharmacologically. It is a pure receptor antagonist. It binds to the progesterone receptor with very high affinity, but it doesn't activate it at all. It just sits there and blocks the real hormone from binding.
It cuts the phone line.
It cuts the phone line completely. Remember, progesterone is progestation. It's the hormone that maintains the uterine lining and keeps it receptive and quiet to support the fetus. If you block that signal with mifepristone, the lining destabilizes and begins to break down. It's luteolytic. It removes the hormonal foundation of the pregnancy.
And in practice, it's usually followed by a second drug, misoprostol.
Yes, a day or two later. Misoprostol is a prostaglandin that causes the uterus to contract and expel the tissue. But mifepristone is the drug that breaks the hormonal lock. Interestingly, because the progesterone receptor is structurally very similar to the glucocorticoid receptor, the stress hormone receptor, mifepristone, also blocks cortisol.
That cross-reactivity is something we see a lot with steroids, isn't it? They all look like chemical cousins.
They're all built from the same cholesterol backbone. The body is very efficient. It repurposes successful designs constantly.
Let's pivot now to one of the most controversial and, I think, important topics in this entire field. Menopausal hormone therapy, or MHT. It used to be called HRT.
And this is where the history lesson is painful but absolutely necessary. For a long, long time, the medical dogma was pretty simple. Menopause is an estrogen deficiency state. Estrogen protects the heart and bones, so let's just replace it. For everyone. Forever.
It seems logical. You're losing something, so you put it back.
It seemed perfectly logical. And then came the WHI, the Women's Health Initiative.
The study that completely shook the world of medicine.
In 2002, they halted the estrogen plus progestin arm of the study early. They released data showing that women on this combo therapy actually had higher risks of heart attacks, strokes, blood clots, and breast cancer than the placebo group.
And prescriptions just plummeted overnight. Millions of women stopped taking their hormones.
They did. But, and this is a huge but, we have spent the last 20-plus years reanalyzing that data. And both Katsung and Goodman and Gilman strongly emphasize what's now called the timing hypothesis, or the critical window hypothesis.
So what was the issue with the original interpretation of this study?
It wasn't that the study was wrong, but the population they studied was very specific. The women in the WHI study were, on average, older. The average age was 63. Many of them had been menopausal for over a decade before they ever started taking the drugs.
So their blood vessels had already had 10 years of aging without estrogen's protective effects.
Exactly. They likely had established atherosclerotic plaques in their arteries. Now here is the double-edged sword of estrogen. On one hand, estrogen is good for a healthy endothelium, the lining of the blood vessel. It keeps it flexible, it promotes nitric oxide. But on the other hand, estrogen also increases clotting factors and can be pro-inflammatory, potentially destabilizing existing plaque.
I see where this is going. If you give estrogen to a newly menopausal 50-year-old with healthy, clean arteries.
The theory is that it keeps them healthy. It acts in a primary prevention role, preventing the plaque from forming in the first place.
But if you give that same estrogen to a 65-year-old who already has established calcified plaque,
he might actually be causing harm. You might cause that plaque to rupture or throw a clot. You are adding a pro-inflammatory, pro-clotting agent to a pre-existing damaged vessel. So the current thinking is that initiating therapy early, within 10 years of menopause, seems to be safe or even protective for the heart. Initiating it late is likely dangerous.
The context involves time. It always comes back to time.
Always.
And there's another rule that Katzon makes very, very bold, the uterus rule.
Yes. This is non-negotiable in clinical practice. If a woman has a uterus, you cannot give her estrogen alone, period.
Why not?
Unopposed estrogen acts like fertilizer on the endometrium. It causes it to constantly grow and proliferate and grow and grow. Eventually, those dividing cells can make mistakes. It leads to endometrial hyperplasia and a 5 to 15-fold increased risk of endometrial cancer.
It is a massive, massive risk increase.
It is an unacceptable risk, so you must add a progestin for at least part of the month. The progestin opposes the estrogen, it limits that growth, it matures the lining, and it brings the cancer risk right back down to baseline.
But if a woman has had a hysterectomy, she has no uterus.
Then you don't need the progestin. You have no endometrium to protect, and actually, the data suggests she's probably better off without it.
Better off without the progestin. Why?
Because of the breast cancer data from the WHI. In that study, the women who were taking estrogen alone because they had no uterus actually had a trend toward a lower risk of breast cancer compared to placebo.
Wait, really? The headline I always remember is hormones cause breast cancer.
That's a common fear, and it's a simplification. But the detailed data suggests that in the combination therapy arm, it was the progestin that might have been the real culprit simulating the breast tissue proliferation, or at least the specific synthetic progestin used in the study, which was medroxyprogesterone acetate, was the problem. Estrogen alone was surprisingly safe for the breast in that specific study population.
That is a critical detail that gets lost in the headlines all the time.
It is absolutely vital for clinical decision-making. Estrogen plus progestin equals a slight increase in breast cancer risk. Estrogen alone seems to be neutral or even protective. But you can only do estrogen alone if the uterus is gone.
This brings us perfectly into Section 5, systemic effects, because we've touched on it. The clotting. Why does estrogen make blood sticky? This isn't just magic. There's a clear mechanism.
It all happens in the liver. When you take an oral estrogen pill, it gets absorbed in the gut, goes into the portal vein, and heads straight to the liver before it gets to the rest of the body. This is called the first pass effect.
So the liver sees a huge concentrated dose of estrogen right away.
A massive bolus, much higher than it would see from the ovaries. And the liver responds to this powerful estrogen signal by altering its protein synthesis. It starts cranking out more coagulation factors. Factor 2, 7, 9X, and fibrinogen.
So it's literally priming the blood to clot more easily.
And at the same time, it decreases the synthesis of antithrombin III, which is one of the body's natural anti-clotting factors. So you are tilting the seesaw heavily toward thrombosis.
Which directly explains the increased risk of DVT, deep vein thrombosis, and pulmonary embolism with oral pills.
Exactly.
But Katzon mentions there's a workaround for this, right? The route of administration matters.
This is a crucial clinical pearl. If you use a patch, a transdermal patch, or a vaginal ring or a gel, the estrogen is absorbed directly into the systemic bloodstream.
It bypasses the portal vein and that first trip to the liver.
It bypasses that initial high concentration first pass in the liver. The liver sees a much more gentle physiologic level of estrogen, so it doesn't get spooked into making all those extra clotting factors.
So the clotting risk is lower with a patch.
Significantly lower with transdermal preparations. For a patient who might have a higher baseline clotting risk, maybe she's overweight or a smoker or has a family history, I'm immediately thinking a patch is a safer choice than a pill.
That is really actionable knowledge. What about the effect on lipids? Cholesterol.
Generally, estrogen is the hero here. It acts on the liver to increase the number of receptors for LDL, so it helps pull bad cholesterol out of the blood. And it also raises HDL, the good cholesterol.
So a favorable profile.
A very favorable profile. But progestins can be the villain again. Especially those older androgenic progestins we talked about earlier, they can reverse that benefit. Their androgenic activity can lower HDL.
So again, in a combined pill, the two drugs are kind of fighting each other on the cholesterol battlefield.
It's a bit of a tug of war. Modern progestins, like norgestimate or desogestrel, are specifically designed to be lipid neutral, so they don't mess up the good work that the estrogen is doing.
And finally, let's talk about bone. We mentioned SERMs before, but just basic estrogen's role.
Estrogen is the guardian of the skeleton. Its primary role is to suppress the activity of osteoclasts.
The bone-eating cells.
Yes. Osteoclasts are cells that dissolve bone matrix to release calcium into the blood. Estrogen keeps them in check. It tells them to undergo apoptosis, or programmed cell death. It keeps their numbers low.
So what happens at menopause?
When menopause hits and estrogen levels plummet, the brake on the osteoclasts is removed, and they go wild.
They just start eating up bone faster than it can be rebuilt by the osteoblasts.
Exactly. Bone resorption dramatically speeds up. That's why postmenopausal osteoporosis is so common and can be so devastating. Estrogen therapy is incredibly effective at stopping this bone loss, but because of all the other risks we've discussed, we generally don't use it just for bone anymore unless other drugs have failed or are not tolerated.
It really makes the job of a clinician sound incredibly difficult. You aren't just prescribing a pill, you are managing a complex portfolio of risks and benefits for each individual woman.
You are. You are constantly balancing the patient's quality of life, or her hot flashes, night sweats, or vaginal atrophy unbearable, against her specific risk profile. Does she have a uterus? Does she have a personal or family history of blood clots? How long has it been since her last menstrual period? It's a very nuanced conversation.
Let's just touch on that cancer risk one more time in Section 6, specifically regarding the breast. Is there any more nuance on how it might increase risk?
Yes, the nuance is density. Goodman and Gilman mentions that the combination of estrogen plus progestin increases breast epithelial cell proliferation. It makes the tissue more busy and more dense, particularly in the terminal duct lobular unit.
And that's where most breast cancers start.
That's right. So higher density on a mammogram makes it harder to read. The normal tissue looks white, and cancer also looks white, so it can be masked. And just biologically, the more your cells are dividing, the more chance there is for a random mutation to occur and stick around.
But what about the absolute risk? We hear these scary numbers.
In the WHI study, the increased absolute risk was about 8 extra cases of breast cancer per 10,000 women per year of use.
That sounds surprisingly low for an individual.
It is statistically significant for sure, but for an individual woman, it's a rare event. However, if you apply that small increased risk to the millions of women who were taking MHT, it translates into thousands of extra cancers. That's the public health dilemma.
Now, what about ovarian cancer? I feel like I've heard the opposite is true there.
You have. This is the flip side of the coin. Taking combined oral contraceptives, which stops ovulation, dramatically reduces the lifetime risk of ovarian cancer.
Significantly.
Very significantly. We're talking about a 20% reduction in risk for every 5 years of use. And what's amazing is that the protection persists for decades, even after you stop taking the pill.
Why does that happen?
The leading theory is the incessant ovulation hypothesis. Think about what ovulation is. It's a physical trauma. The egg literally has to burst through the surface of the ovary every month. That causes inflammation, bleeding, and requires rapid cell division to repair the wound.
And repair always implies a risk of mutation.
Exactly. So if you stop that repeated trauma for 5 or 10 or 15 years by using the pill, you're essentially giving the ovary a long rest. Less trauma, less repair, less inflammation, and ultimately, less cancer.
That is the choice aspect again, isn't it? By intervening in the monthly cycle, we are fundamentally changing the long-term continuity of that organ's health.
That's a perfect way to summarize it.
So we've covered a huge amount of ground. We've covered the rhythm of the clock, the KNDD neurons, the loop with the paradox of positive feedback, the receptors, those amazing shapeshifters, and the SERMs, the interventions like the pill, the patch, and mifepristone, and the risk clotting and cancer. As we move to the outro, I just want to try and synthesize all this.
Let's bring it back to that orbital aesthetic you mentioned at the start.
These drugs aren't hammers. They're not brute force instruments. They are gravitational nudges.
Yes, we are managing cycles, whether it's the monthly cycle of fertility or the much larger life cycle of menopause. The goal of pharmacology here is to align our intervention with the body's current phase and its specific needs.
And the future of this field really seems to be in selectivity.
The SERMs. That's the dream. We want all the benefits without the risks. We want a single molecule that tells the bone to stay strong, tells the brain to stop having hot flashes, tells the heart to stay clean, but at the same time tells the breast and the uterus to please stay quiet.
And do we have that holy grail drug yet?
Not perfectly. Raloxifene protects the bone and the breast, but it can actually cause hot flashes and doesn't seem to help the heart much. Basedoxifene is another really interesting one, often paired with conjugated estrogens to protect the uterus without needing a progestin at all. We are getting closer and closer to designer estrogens.
That is a very cool concept, designer hormones.
It is. But until we have that perfect molecule, we live by the clinical logic that Katsung lays out so clearly. Treat the patient, not the number. Use the lowest effective dose for the shortest duration necessary to achieve the patient's goal.
That seems like a golden rule for all of pharmacology, honestly.
It is, But it is especially true here, where these hormones touch almost every single system in the body.
I have a provocative thought I'd like to leave our listeners with. We've been talking about these hormones mostly in the context of reproduction. That's how they're framed. But we keep seeing them pop up everywhere else. Bone, brain, affecting mood and memory. Blood vessels, the immune system.
Metabolism, insulin sensitivity, gut health.
Right. So are we fundamentally wrong to just call them sex hormones?
That is a very, very valid question. They are ancient molecules. They evolved to regulate reproduction, yes, but to do that successfully, they had to regulate the entire organism. You can't reproduce effectively if your bones are breaking or your metabolism is failing or your immune system is attacking the fetus.
So they are, really,
Oh, what?
system regulators.
They are master regulators of survival and continuity. Reproduction is just the ultimate mechanism they use to pass the baton from one generation to the next. They ensure that the vessel, the body, is strong enough and stable enough to carry the precious cargo.
I love that framing. They are the managers of the biological timeline.
Exactly.
Well, we have unpacked a tremendous amount today, from the KNDI neurons firing in the hypothalamus all the way down to the shape-shifting receptors in the nucleus of a single cell.
And the really complex trade-offs of the pill and MHT that patients and clinicians face every day.
If you're listening and you want to really cement this knowledge, go open Katsung Chapter 40. Look at the diagrams of the cycle. Literally trace the rise and fall of the hormones. Find the LH surge. And look at the tables of progestins. See which ones are androgenic and which ones aren't.
And then open Goodman and Gilman, Chapter 44, to look at those beautiful receptor diagrams. Visualize that helix 12 lid folding or not folding. It really helps to see the geometry to understand the mechanism.
Knowledge is the only way to make an informed choice.
Well said.
Thanks for diving deep with us.
Always a pleasure.
Stay curious.